Good afternoon, and thank you all for joining us today. My name is Richard Ghazal, Executive Director of In Defense of Christians. I'm honored to be joined today by a diverse coalition of partner organizations, including our co-host, the Save Armenia organization. We stand together today to draw attention to the ongoing and active persecution and even genocide of Christians in the Middle East, the Caucasus, and North Africa. And more importantly, we demand action. Just in the span of the 20th century, due to persecution and genocide, the population of Christians in the Middle East has plummeted from 20% down to 2% today, and it continues to plummet. This is a catastrophic trend. The sad reality is that Christianity throughout the Middle East now finds itself on the brink of extinction, which sadly may come to fruition in our lifetimes. And with it, a 2,000-year-old Christian heritage would also disappear. This is not a political matter. In fact, it's more than just a humanitarian matter. It's a civilizational question before us. Will we act to stop this trend, or will we stand by and allow, and in many cases even enable, continued crimes against humanity? Earlier today, the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom, known as USCIRF, released its 2024 International Religious Freedom Report. USCIRF is a bipartisan federal commission established by the International Religious Freedom Act of 1998 as a watchdog body on matters of international religious freedom. USCIRF's annual report provides detailed analysis and policy recommendations to the President of the United States, the State Department, and the U.S. Congress concerning state and non-state violators of international religious freedom. USCIRF recommends the most egregious religious freedom violators be classified as countries of particular concern. According to the 2024 report released today, USCIRF recommends that Azerbaijan be designated as a country of particular concern. In September 2023, after about 10 months of starving Armenian Christians of Nagorno-Karabakh, Azerbaijan committed ethnic cleansing against 120,000 civilians of the world's oldest Christian nation, expelling them from the land they've called home for thousands of years and creating a humanitarian disaster. As a retired member of the United States Armed Forces and as a grandchild of the Armenian genocide, I'm outraged to know that Azerbaijan is a beneficiary of U.S. military assistance. No active perpetrator of genocide should ever be enabled by American military, money, or weapons. The U.S. must discontinue military aid to Azerbaijan, and the U.S. State Department must heed USCIRF's recommendation. USCIRF has also recommended that Nigeria be designated as a country of particular concern. Today, Nigeria stands as the deadliest place in the world to be a Christian. In 2023, at least 5,000 Christians in Nigeria were killed for their faith at the hands of Fulani militants and Boko Haram, which is ISIS's Nigerian franchise. Christians killed in Nigeria account for over 80% of all religious-based murders of Christians globally. Not only has the Nigerian government failed to respond effectively to the crisis, but its actions have also made a bad situation even worse, answering atrocities with more atrocities. Unfortunately, the U.S. government, and particularly the State Department, has turned a blind eye to this ongoing crisis, culminating last year with a decision to remove Nigeria's designation as a country of particular concern. We stand here today in front of the U.S. Department of State to demand that USCIRF recommendations be acted upon, restore Nigeria's designation as a country of particular concern. At this time, I'm proud to invite my friend Aram Hamparian to the podium. Aram is Executive Director of the Armenian National Committee of America. Aram.
President Biden's Department of State, like President Trump's before him, is guilty of complicity in Azerbaijan's genocide of Christian Armenians in Artsakh. These have not been innocent errors of inattention or inaction, but rather active complicity, moral and material. Arming Azerbaijan, emboldening aggression, abandoning Armenians. No aid programs in Artsakh, no airlift during the blockade. Tough talk from this building, from senior officials who said, we will not tolerate an Azerbaijani attack on Nagorno-Karabakh. We will not countenance Azerbaijani aggression, and yet they did nothing. There was no action. No sanctions even after September's attack, no designation of genocide or even ethnic cleansing, no response to Azerbaijan's ongoing occupation of Armenian land, no pressure for the release of illegally detained Armenian prisoners of war, no investigation into Azerbaijani war crimes, no U.S. resolution at the United Nations to ensure the safe return of Armenians to Artsakh, not a single step to reverse a reversible genocide. Instead, just flowers to the funeral. Roughly $20 million, about $150 per refugee forced from their home with basically the shirts on their backs. Very quickly, this building, the State Department, Biden's, has returned to business as usual, and there's no better example of that than the failure of the Biden administration, of this State Department, to designate Azerbaijan as a country of particular concern for its violations of religious liberty. It's for this reason we are so deeply grateful to the members of USCIRF, of the U.S. Commission for International Religious Freedom, for their designation, for their recommendation to the State Department that Azerbaijan be red listed. This commission, the U.S. Commission, is a much-needed watchdog for the lapdogs here at the State Department. We thank each USCIRF member who voted to designate Azerbaijan as a CPC and call upon our State Department to follow their lead in red listing Azerbaijan for its crimes against religious liberty. Thank you.
Thank you, Aram. Our next speaker is Nadine Maenza. Nadine is president of the International Religious Freedom Secretariat and former chair of the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom. Nadine.
Thank you. Thank you so much for including me in today's important press conference. As you heard, the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom today released their 2024 report as mandated by the International Religious Freedom Act of 1998. Because USCIRF independently assesses religious freedom conditions globally without considering the bilateral relationships of those countries, the reporting is among the most accurate and the most credible. And once again, this report is filled with excellent recommendations, including that the State Department should designate 17 as countries of particular concern, or CPCs, because of their particularly severe violations of religious freedom, meeting the threshold of egregious, systematic, and ongoing. For the first time, as you just heard, USCIRF has recommended Azerbaijan be designated as a country of particular concern. Other countries they highlighted as having among the worst conditions in the world, along with Azerbaijan, are India and Nigeria, that also should be designated by the State Department and currently are not. They also recommended 11 countries are listed on the special watch list for meeting 2 of that 3 egregious, systematic, and ongoing test of religious freedom violations. And only one country from last year's report, only one. That's the first time in 6 years that only one country has seen any improvements, and that was really Central African Republic. That it wasn't that they had improvements as much as they didn't have as many violations to meet the threshold that were actually related to religious issues. So they were removed from all the reporting. And Syria was moved from the CPC to the special watch list because the violations that are particularly severe, that are still ongoing there, are being done by terrorist groups, HTS, and the Turkish-backed militias that are targeting religious minorities. They also added Kyrgyzstan to the special watch list for their worsening conditions. Every year since 2019, USCIRF has listed the trajectory of each country's conditions on the first line of that country report. Since this time, this is the most negative report USCIRF has put out, showing the worsening conditions globally and what that means for peace and stability worldwide. Out of the 28 in this report, 18 countries had conditions that stayed the same, with 10 having deteriorating conditions. And by staying the same, we mean like North Korea, for instance, stayed the same as having among the worst in the world. So some simply just can't get worse. By contrast, last year, 3 countries saw improvements, and the year before had 5 countries seeing improvements. As you just heard, Secretary of State Anthony Blinken added Azerbaijan to the special watch list earlier this year, and USCIRF had made that recommendation since 2013. And so we were asking if for the Secretary of State to again follow USCIRF's recommendations and designate Azerbaijan as a country of particular concern. USCIRF has long asked the U.S. to push Azerbaijan to amend their very strict religion law to comply with international standards. But instead, over the last 3 years, Azerbaijan has moved in the opposite direction, continuing to introduce new restrictions. In fact, Pew Research Center's Government Restrictions on Religion Index now lists Azerbaijan in their highest category at 17 out of 198 countries as among the worst in the world. Azerbaijan continues to hold as many as 183 political prisoners of conscience, a majority being peaceful religious believers, and there are still prisoners of war unaccounted for. In December, USCRIF reported that, quote, Azerbaijan allegedly continues to commit war crimes and other abuses in the context of its conflict with Armenia over the territory of Nagorno-Karabakh. As you know, in June 2023, the Azerbaijani government turned a partial blockade into a full blockade as the world was silent, then launched a military operation in September, forcing 120,000 Armenian Christians to flee their homeland in an ethnic cleansing in Nagorno-Karabakh. And just this week, Caucasus Heritage Watch released images showing the demolition of St. John's Baptist Church, a 19th century church in Nagorno-Karabakh's Susa area, and the razing of a village known as Kar-in-Tak. Both had significant Armenian heritage now erased. In fact, satellite images show a mosque under construction right over the village that was razed. In February, the International Court of Justice ruled that Azerbaijan must, quote, take all necessary measures to present and punish acts of vandalism and desecration affecting Armenian cultural heritage, including but not limited to churches and other places of worship, monuments, landmarks, cemeteries, and artifacts. We appreciate Secretary Blinken being personally involved in monitoring peace talks with Azerbaijan and Armenia, speaking with both of their leaders, even about tweeting about that this week. As Armenia cedes villages on the border to Azerbaijan to further peace talks, it is important that Blinken follow through with his commitment to support a strong and independent Armenia, and to hold Azerbaijan accountable for any future violations of the ceasefire and the continuing violations of religious freedom against Armenians and other minorities inside their own country. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Nadine. Next up, we have my friend Sean Nelson, who is legal counsel for international religious freedom at the Alliance Defending Freedom International.
Thank you, Rich, and thank you for inviting me to speak. I'm going to be focusing primarily on Nigeria, which is a country that is facing just extreme crises when it comes to religious freedom, when it comes to violence from non-state actors, from terrorists, from the Islamic State West Africa, Boko Haram, from various armed militants that roam throughout the Middle Belt and the North. It's a country where it's one of only 7 countries in the entire world where you can be sentenced to death for committing alleged blasphemy. For sending a WhatsApp message that somebody else doesn't like, you could be stoned to death. You could be taken into prison and sit there for years and years on end. All of these kinds of things are captured in USCIRF's annual report, which I highly recommend that you read, especially the section on Nigeria. USCIRF has been a fantastic champion for religious minorities, for the persecuted within Nigeria for years. For many, many years, they have recommended that Nigeria be counted amongst one of the worst countries in the world, that country of particular concern list, and be designated that way because of the extreme levels of violence and because of much of the discrimination and those blasphemy laws that are there on the books in the 12 northern states there. Back in 2020, right at the end of the previous administration, the State Department did, in fact, designate Nigeria as a country of particular concern. That was a wonderful policy decision. It was something that the people that I speak with in Nigeria, I speak with many, many lawyers, many people who are victims over there, religious leaders, all of them were very happy about that because they said, finally, the international world, the United States, is standing up and saying, this is a real problem. This is really happening. When we say that there are thousands of Christians being killed every single year for their faith, that's the highest recognition that we can have. But then inexplicably, the following year, despite the unanimity amongst the international religious freedom community about what was happening in Nigeria and the legitimacy of that designation. Inexplicably, the State Department and Secretary Blinken removed the designation, and they didn't just downgrade it. They didn't say, okay, well, maybe there's some small improvements. In fact, in terms of the killings and the deaths based on, at least in part, on religion, those would go up every single year, and they've continued to go up. They didn't say it's a special watch list country. They said there's nothing to see here. There's nothing that we need to do. And it was completely removed from any of the International Religious Freedom Act designations. And when you look at the International Religious Freedom Act, it doesn't say maybe they can add these things, maybe they can consider these different kind of geopolitical decisions. It says you shall designate these countries when you have severe violations that are systematic, egregious, and ongoing. And I can think of a number of countries where that's happening, and one of those countries is definitely Nigeria. This past year in the USCIRF reporting, again, if you look at that report that was just released today, they look at a report from a group called Inner Society, and that report says that potentially 8,000 Christians were targeted just last year for their faith. 7,000 of those are from Christians who are in the north and in the Middle Belt, who are being attacked by these terrorist groups, by these militant groups. These are people who are doing nothing. They're just sitting on their farms. They're just trying to live their lives. They're worshiping in their churches, and they're being attacked over and over again. When you've seen what happens to somebody who's been attacked with a machete, that's not an image that leaves your mind very soon. The USCRIF report also highlights many of the cases, many of the blasphemy cases that are so outrageous there. One of these cases involved a young woman named Deborah Emmanuel Yakubu. She was a young student in her early 20s up in Sokoto State, going to college, trying to get an education, trying to support her community and her family. But because some of her classmates took offense to some WhatsApp messages that she had sent to her classmates in a group WhatsApp chat, they decided to form a mob, 50 to 100 people, record it on video, beat her to death, stone her, and light her on fire. The authorities arrested two individuals, and at the beginning of last year, those individuals were released completely. Their cases dismissed because the prosecution failed to prosecute them. So they wander free, just like every other attacker that you see in the country. There's total impunity. They almost never, ever get brought to justice. But instead, the people who raise concerns about this, like Rhoda Jatau, she has been prosecuted for 18 months she was prosecuted. Why? Because she said it was wrong. It was wrong to try to kill Deborah Emmanuel Yakubu. And for that, a mob formed, set her neighborhood on fire, and she was held incommunicado, couldn't talk to lawyers, couldn't talk to family members, and was prosecuted for 18 months. She finally got out on bail because the international community spoke out. You have people like Yahya Sharif Aminu, who's a Sufi Muslim, who's a musician, and he shared musical lyrics, in a WhatsApp chat back in 2020. People took offense to those. They burned down his house. Did any of those attackers get arrested? No. But he got arrested, and he's been sitting in jail for 4 years now. He was convicted and sentenced to death. Eventually that conviction was overturned, but they said you have to go back and face these same charges again, and you could be facing the death penalty on those. Thankfully, he's now at the Supreme Court. That's a case that ADF International is very, very proud to support, and we hope that the Supreme Court of Nigeria does the right thing. But what we need is the international community to speak up about this. We need Secretary Blinken and the Biden administration to change this designation, to make what is perfectly clear to the international religious freedom community, to the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, to make that U.S. policy that, yes, there are serious, severe violations of religious freedom happening every single day. Over Christmas this past year in Plateau State, over 200 Christians were killed by Fulani militants who just came in the middle of the night while they were celebrating Christmas. Has that led to any arrests? Has anybody been prosecuted? No. Instead, what's happened is more attacks happen every single week in that community, in Benue, in states all across the north. Right now in Congress, over in the House of Representatives, there's a bill, HRES 82, which would call on the President, call on Secretary of State to designate Nigeria as a country of particular concern, to do everything that it could to make sure that those victims, the prisoners of these blasphemy laws, these accusations, find justice. We need that to be passed. I hope that the House of Representatives brings that up for a floor vote very soon. In the meantime, please read the USCIRF report, the annual report that just came out. Read the section on Nigeria, on all of the different countries. It's an essential tool for keeping countries accountable and keeping our own government accountable for its decisions. Thank you.
Thank you, Sean. Next, I'm proud to invite to the podium former member of Congress, member of House of Representatives, and the man responsible for the International Religious Freedom Act of 1998, the legislation that created the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, Mr. Frank Wolf.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation. I want to be clear, I am here as an individual, former member of Congress, although I am a commissioner on USCIRF. Sadly, religious freedom conditions all over the world remain dire. When you look at the number of countries, 12 that the State Department designated as CPC, Burma, China, Cuba, Eritrea, Iran, Nicaragua where they're purging the Catholic Church, North Korea, Pakistan, Russia, Saudi Arabia, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, and it also includes 5 additional countries that the State Department has not designated as Afghanistan, Azerbaijan, India, Nigeria, and Vietnam. As USCIRF has previously observed a dramatic increase in religious freedom violations by the government of Azerbaijan in 2021, 2022, and again in 2023. And this year has said that they should be a significant increase and ought to be a CPC country. I have been to Nagorno-Karabakh. It isn't just a story that I read that somebody told me. I was there with Bernice Cox. I've seen what was done. And as you read the latest report, was took at the church of St. John the Baptist Church. So I think this country has to be designated as a CPC country. USCIRF has also recommended Nigeria as a CPC country since 2009. I have been to Nigeria. I've seen what's taken place. From Christmas of this year up until now, the number of people that have been killed. USCIRF has recommended not only a CPC designation, but a special envoy designation, similar to what President Bush did with regard to Senator John Danforth, with regard to the Sudan. China, the People's Republic of China, remained one of the worst violators of religious freedom, and the State Department, in agreement with USCIRF, most recently designated as a CPC country last December. As the world has seen, Chinese authorities continue to commit genocide, forced labor, political indoctrination, mass surveillance, intrusive government homestays, forced interfaith and inter-ethnic marriages, and forced sterilizations and forced abortions. In Tibet, where I have been and seen what is taking place in the Tibetan community, at every Tibetan monastery, there is the public security police that monitors the monastery. The government of China has separated more than 1 million Tibetan children from their parents, putting them in state-run boarding schools where they're forcibly assimilated. Authorities continue to detain and imprison other religious minorities as well, including underground Catholics, house church Protestants, Falun Gong practitioners, where they're taking their organs out. 60,000 last year taking their organs out, some while they're still alive. Members of the Church of Almighty God and many others for not submitting to the state's totalitarian control over religious affairs and religious life. I, along with many others seeing this, really have to deal with this. And also in Hong Kong, which if you ever been to Hong Kong, it was a very free, open. Now they're persecuting the Catholic Church and prosecuting Cardinal Zen, a 92-year-old Catholic cardinal. In the USCIRF report and the additional views behind with regard to China, and this is very, very important for all the countries that we're talking about, here's what it says. Because the egregious acts of religious persecution by the Chinese government continue unabated, It is imperative that lobbying for the Chinese government and its interests be banned. Lobbying for the Chinese government and its interests should be banned. It goes on to say China's influence is spreading worldwide. China supports Iran. China supports Iran, which provides training and weapons for Hamas attacks on Israel and supplies to Hezbollah and the Houthis. China aids Russia. Yet China aids Russia in its war with regard to Ukraine and supports North Korea, one of the world's most violent and vicious persecutors of people of faith. China supports Nicaragua. China supports Nicaragua, where they're purging the Catholic Church, forced the Archbishop back to Rome, and also China supports and aids Cuba. There are rising concerns, and I want to say this very, very carefully, because as we all have relatives and family who serve in the military, there are rising concerns over China possibly attacking Taiwan, which many experts believe may lead to U.S. involvement and loss of American military lives. And then the USCIRF report ends by saying, considering all of this, I think the words of 18th century British parliamentarian William Wilberforce spoke about the evils of the slave trade. He said, you may choose to look the other way, but you can never again say you do not know. For the good of our country and for religious freedom in China and worldwide, Congress cannot look the other way. Congress must ban lobbying for China, and I think that Congress has to deal with it, and all of the groups of all of the backgrounds who care deeply about religious freedom all over the world ought to be for banning lobbying. No one in this town should lobby again for China or the Chinese interests. Thanks again for having this.
Thank you very much, Mr. Wolf. Always spirited and always on point, most importantly. I'd like to thank all of our partners for joining us today. At this time, I'd like to open it up for questions if there's anyone.
Yeah, there are a lot of articles today about how much Azerbaijan is spending on lobbying. This question is for Congressman. What do you have to say today in Aram about what this report signal sends to anybody doing business and representing those countries right now?
Thank you. I'll go ahead and state the question, then hand it over to Mr. Wolf. The question was directed to Mr. Wolf, and that was, with the release of today's USCRIF report identifying and recommending Azerbaijan as a country of particular concern, what's the message that it sends out to lobbyists here in D.C. who represent Azerbaijan, and we know there are many of them? Mr. Wolf.
Well, I'm speaking for myself today, but what I believe it should do, and all of the groups, it's not enough to say, to have a conference and pull people together and talk about what's taking place and then go home and go off and do something. There's two things that I believe personally as an individual. One, there should be now in this Congress a total and complete ban for lobbying for China. No ifs or buts about it at all. That has to be done. And anybody who says they're interested in religious freedom and human rights have to be for this. Secondly, my own view, it's my view. If a country is a CPC designated for 3 years, they should be banned from having lobbying. The reason we say 3 years is that gives them an opportunity. If you hire a lobbyist, that gives them the opportunity to change. Maybe they will change. But if 3 consecutive years go by and there's no change, there ought to be a total ban. That'll be for Azerbaijan and for all the other countries. So one, total ban for lobbying now, and a ban for any country that is a CPC designated country for 3 or more years.
I would echo Congressman Wolf's comments 100%. I would say that the BGR group, the Friedlander Group, and others get millions and millions of dollars. They struggled mightily, probably as recently as just a few hours before the release of this report, to not get a CPC designation. But the fact of the matter is that the facts simply could not support that. The facts are that Azerbaijan is one of the worst abusers in the world. The law does not leave any room for Azerbaijan to avoid accountability. The law that Congressman Wolf helped draft so many years ago. So the facts, the law, and the fealty of a majority of the commission to our American values, our belief in religious freedom, those were insurmountable despite despite the millions and millions of dollars that Azerbaijan poured into affecting the report that was released today. Mark my words, they will do everything they can to roll back this report and to prevent the State Department from holding Azerbaijan accountable. It's our work, all of ours, not just Azerbaijan, but China, Saudi Arabia, and all these other countries that are being designated today. It's our job to hold them to account, to not allow foreign money, foreign influence to help bad actors escape accountability here in Washington.
I think we have another question.
Did Azerbaijan's blockade of Nagorno-Karabakh and the eventual military incursion into Nagorno-Karabakh play a critical role in determining the CPC recommendation to anybody who might know?
Thank you. The question was, what role did the last year's blockade and forced starvation of Nagorno-Karabakh, an eventual invasion and an ethnic cleansing of Nagorno-Karabakh by Azerbaijan, what role did that play in today's USCIRF designation?
Yeah. I'm sure that it played a role, although it was not reflected in the actual documents submitted today. It's hard to imagine. This may be the dissenters to this report, and there were 4 of them, clearly did everything they could to dumb down this report and ultimately to avoid a CPC designation. They failed in avoiding a CPC designation, but it does seem as though they succeeded in some regard to not having the exodus, the forced exodus, the genocide, the ethnic cleansing of 120,000 Armenians mentioned in the actual report, which is, there's a great irony to that, because of the 120,000 people who were forced from their homes and churches and monasteries, every single one is a member of our Armenian apostolic faith. So it was clearly a religious dimension to this. I'm certain that the majority that voted for the CPC designation took that into account. It appears as though the minority, ill-advised, certainly ill-informed, did whatever they could to reduce sort of the indictment, the list of the bill of particulars against Azerbaijan, but I think ultimately they will be held to account.
I just want to add that in December, USCIRF did release a country report that is a deeper dive. The annual report is tough because I think they have, 1,800 words that they could write about a country. But if you look at the December country report that USCIRF put out, it actually does talk about war crimes in Nagorno-Karabakh and is actually much harsher than the annual report was. So perhaps that was the way that they dealt to talk about Azerbaijan this year.
Thank you for that. Are there any other questions?
One more question. What signal does this send to private companies that are doing business in these countries? Should they reconsider their investment now that this has been clearly stated, the position of where the United States stands on this issue?
Thank you for that question. The question was, what message should private companies who do business with Azerbaijan take in the wake of this USCIRF designation for Azerbaijan? I'll give a quick answer, and I'd invite anybody else who wishes to also give an answer. Before today's designation, it was the worst kept secret in Washington that Azerbaijan is a human rights violator. But now all ambiguity has been taken away. It was documented in today's report. The analysis is clear, and it's unambiguous at this point. The action is now on the State Department to make its determination. But also now, private companies, lobbyists, as well as private companies are on notice that they are now doing business with human rights violators, and in fact, perpetrators, I would say, perpetrators of genocide.
I just want to add that there is so much research that shows a correlation between economic prosperity, peace and stability, and human rights and religious freedom conditions. In countries that have deteriorating conditions, negative religious freedom conditions, you're going to see an economy that's going to reflect that. And so countries, when investors are looking at countries and they see that they're among the worst in the world at violating religious freedom, they should know that there'll be an economic cost with that investment. So that's one of the reasons, another great argument and for why countries that are on the line or that are working to improve their conditions should ask for some help, ask for some professionals to come in and help them figure out how they could improve their conditions, things they can do on the ground, laws they can change. This doesn't have to be a one-way deterioration. These countries can all change their conditions by making changes internally and by having people come in and work with their grassroots, building up civil society. There's all sorts of things they could do to help improve their conditions. And at the end of the day, they'll actually have economic, increased economic activity will be one of the side effects.
The answer is, of course, I'm going to go back to one of the things that I said, but another thing that I didn't cover. Keep in mind that if you're a company or if you're a lobby firm, you have to think about this. Every, not most, every faith group is experiencing the harsh actions of the Chinese government. Every. That means the faith group that you belong to, the faith group of your next door neighbor, the faith group of your mother and father. Every group. The Catholic Church and the Protestant church houses, their leaders have been in prison. And some have disappeared. I remember there was one Catholic bishop, Congressman Chris Smith gave Holy Communion to him. He was taken away and never seen again. Never seen again. There's cultural genocide against Tibet. In every Tibetan monastery, there's the public security police that's stationed in that monastery. And they follow it. And if you recall, you must be following it. There are a number of Tibetan Buddhists who have self-immolated themselves because of what is taking place. There's active genocide. The word genocide can be thrown around sometimes very, very loosely. But there's active, and it meets the Lemkin definition, there's active genocide with regard to Uyghur Muslims. When I see what's taking place to millions of Uyghur Muslims in that country, how can you see that and not want to do something about it and not be involved in anything like that? Organs are being harvested by Falun Gong. Look at the Hudson Institute. Last year they did a piece at Hudson. 60,000 Falun Gong had their organs taken out, and some. Can you imagine it? Some while they were still alive, and then. In Hong Kong, most people have been to Hong Kong. You could walk down the streets. Most of the young people in the Catholic Church have been arrested. Jimmy Lai has been in prison for how many years? Jimmy and Cardinal Zen, God bless. I pray for Cardinal Zen every single night. Cardinal Zen, a 92-year-old cardinal. 92-year-old cardinal. And they're prosecuting it. So how can it not be? And then in closing, what I said. The influence is worldwide. China supports Iran. Have you been seeing what's taking place? What Iran is doing with regard to the Houthis? Have you seen what's regard to Hezbollah? They're getting all the weapons. Have you seen with regard to Hamas? China aids Russia. Have you been seeing and following what Russia is doing in Ukraine and North Korea? Have you read the report about North Korea? When they capture somebody and catch somebody that's trying to cross the border, what actually happens to them? In Nicaragua, Bishop Alvarez has been expelled. In Nicaragua, Mother Teresa's group has been expelled. God bless Mother Teresa has been expelled. And in Cuba. So the answer is yes. You can't do business without thinking about this and certainly you don't want to have a lobbyist to change anything. Reminds me of the Simon and Garfunkel song, The Boxer. Man hears what he wants to hear and disregards the rest. As William Wilberforce said, you can never again say you do not know. Because if you read the USCIRF report, which is bipartisan, nonpartisan, you can see what's taking place. So yes, what's going on has to have an impact with regard to the businesses.
Any other questions? Wonderful. Thank you so much. I'd like to thank our partners. I'd like to thank the folks here present today and those joining us virtually. If you have any questions following this live broadcast, please feel free to contact us. You can reach me at richard@indefenseofchristians.org. You can also watch this broadcast replay on demand, in fact, on our social media, In Defense of Christians, the Armenian National Committee of America, and Save Armenia organization. Thank you for joining us today, and we wish you a good day.